Okay, so we've waited the 45 minutes for the sponge to rise. I'm going to grab it out of the oven. You can kind of see how it's ballooned here. This hasn't risen as much as I want it to. That's all right. We'll keep going. I'm going to uncover it. All right, so now we add the salt and the oil. So I got to check my measurements here. Salt. Four teaspoons. Okay, so the recipe calls for 4 teaspoons. I'm going to do 2 tablespoons for my double recipe. And I just sprinkle it over the top of the sponge. Like that. Salt goes away. And then it calls for 1/3 cup of oil. Again, doubling the recipe, so I go with 2/3 of a cup. Now, I'm using olive oil. I've also used vegetable oil in the past. Again, it's about taste. Olive oil, you're going to taste a little bit more of the olive oil in the bread. Regular vegetable oil, you're probably not going to taste a lot of it. Again, I just try and get it, swirl it evenly over the top. I'll do that again. So there's 2/3. Get rid of you guys. Put my olive oil over here. So this is kind of the important step when you're dealing with a sponge rise, is how you do the folding process. This is when the gluten structure becomes more important. So what you don't want to do is drop right down in the middle and then just stir, because you're going to break apart all that gluten you've spent the time rising to build. So what you do is kind of like the same motion you did when you were beating the dough. You want to go from the side and kind of fold it. It's called folding. So I come like this and I bring up. I swirl around and I bring up. And I do it gently until I feel that it's been incorporated. You know, at the same time I kind of give my pot a stir. You want to go from the outside, fold it up and over into the middle. So really, you're bringing the sides of the dough up into the middle. Now, you can see that I'm doing this on a towel. It's because this particular pan and countertop, it leaves scratches and stuff, and I'm going to knead on this, and I don't want that gunk from the bottom of this pan to get on here for when I knead. So I'm just going to try and incorporate this into the sponge. You can kind of see when it starts to happen. Again, you don't want to knock it down too much, because you don't want to knock all that air and mess up all that gluten that you just spent building up. So I'm going to call that good. I'd show you, but it just looks like sponge is just lower. Here. A little bit. All right. So what I'm going to do now is start adding the rest of my flour into the mixture. And again, you want to do this the same way you did for the sponge, a cup or two at a time. Incorporate it a little bit more, incorporate it a little bit more. And you want to do that until the dough is pretty much pulling away from the sides of the pan, so it's not sticking to the pan anymore. And this is where, again, that tricky thing about flour and bread comes in, is some days I've done this where I've needed every single cup of flour, and you want to continue on with this folding motion, trying not to break up the gluten strands too much. If you get the Tassajara bread book, there's a whole section of how to do this motion, and it explains better why it's good. So what I was saying about the flour, I've done bread recipes where it's used every bit of flour that it calls for, plus some. And I've done the same recipe a couple days later and didn't take as much flour. I don't know why that is. It's one of the mysteries of bread. You'll be able to kind of judge it on your own the more you do this. You know, once you get more flour in here, the dough seems to firm up a little bit more. So when you're digging, you can really get to the bottom of your bowl and try and scoop. So you're getting the bottom ingredients up to the top and kind of fold the dough up on top of itself. And that's what really mixes it. These first steps, man, these first cups of flour are really sticky, ooey gooey. The dough is going to stick to the spatula, it's going to stick to the bowl, it's going to stick to your hands. That's okay, because the more flour you add, the less it's going to stick. And the more firm up, the dough will firm up more and become more dough-like than less liquid, more dough. So just bear with me while I do this. Again, I probably should add music or something going to entertain you. But I've always found it interesting about that flour thing, that some days, you know, sometimes it takes a lot, sometimes it takes a little. You know, I've never been able to explain it. People I've talked to who've been making bread all their lives have never been able to explain it. To my satisfaction, at least. You know, it's always going to be pretty close to the amount of the recipe, but where that really comes into play is the kneading of the dough. You can see my dough is starting to firm up a little bit more. Pull away from the sides a little bit more. I've lost track of how many cups of flour I have, but that's okay because I know for this recipe now, I'm using this entire bag of flour for doubling the recipe. If you're doing just a single recipe, make sure you keep track of how much flour you are using, just so you know. And you can have that mental note for later. And this is really starting to turn into, you know, a more solid piece of dough. It's coming more away from the bowl. See, look, I have dough all over me. Nothing shows you're out of shape like making bread, let me tell you. Be my last cup before I pour it out onto the table. You really want to make sure you get under the dough and get all that flour incorporated. I mean, listen, this is going to be a floury, doughy mess. It's not going to look like a nice ball of dough until you've kneaded it. Right now, you're just trying to get the incorporated the best you can by stirring it into a state that's easier. Now, I'm not measuring anymore because I know at some point it's going to all come together. Again, this isn't the first time I've made this bread, so I can judge pretty well what I'm looking for. I mean, really what you're looking for is for when you're stirring it, the bread is no longer sticking to the sides of the bowl. It's pretty free and clear. So I usually get it to about this point. Can you see? So when I stir, see how the whole thing is moving? It's not really sticking to the sides. All right? That's the point I like to get it to. The next part is kneading it, so I'm going to get rid of this, put it over there. And this is the part where in the recipe it says, you know, you might need an extra cup of flour about. You know, sure, okay. But I always have more flour on hand. Like, I know it usually takes this entire bag to make this bread. I always have my all-purpose flour on standby in case I need more. And really that iffy factor is when you're kneading it, when you add more or less than what the recipe calls for. So that's my dough. Keep my spatula out. The next step is to, they always say, dust your surface with flour. I don't dust, I pile. I mean, I dust, but I get a lot of flour down. I don't like my dough sticking to the counter. It's gonna incorporate. I mean, look how much flour I got there. That's a good amount of flour. I also make sure I flour my hands, because this dough is gonna stick to you. The more flour you have on your hands, the better. So I'm just gonna turn out my dough onto the counter. See how it gloops there? And I'm gonna scrape the inside of this bowl as much as I can to get all that dough that's stuck to it off of the side, so when I need, I can incorporate, you know, the leftover bits and pieces into the dough. And when you first start to knead, it's gonna seem a little chunky, a little gross, a little nasty. It's gonna stick to you. That's just the nature of the dough. The flour hasn't been fully incorporated yet. You know, the gluten structure hasn't been fully built. Kneading the dough incorporates the rest of your flour, get your gluten structure built up, and what it's doing is aligning all those, all the gluten fibers. You know how like crystal, like ice, when you make ice, it aligns all those molecules in the water to nice, straight, solid lines. And that's kind of the same principle with your gluten. That's what you want to do by kneading, is align those gluten molecules so it makes a strong dough. What I'm doing now is I start to knead the dough I turn it, I pull it over, and I push. When I first start doing this, I kind of do it nice and light because the dough is going to be sticky, it's going to be nasty. You don't want to knock all your air out of it at first. You know, just nice and light. Just keep incorporating your flour. Try and spread it on. Also what I'm doing is I have my bowl in the sink here and I'm filling it with water to kind of soak to get, so that when I'm done kneading, I can quickly wash that bowl and put the dough right back in it to rise. Some people at this point, you know, turn their oven back on to heat it back up nice and warm to rise again. I don't. I don't feel I need to do that with the bread flour because it's nice and light. But some people do it with the wheat flour because, you know, it's a denser flour, it needs a little bit more help to rise. So you can see as the more the flour incorporates, the less sticky it gets, and the harder I'm able to work the dough. I'm always mindful to kind of keep adding a little bit of flour here and there. So much of this part is about the feel. And this is where adding the flour gets tricky. Your recipe's gonna, the recipe says knead until the dough is smooth. Yeah, that's true. Knead until the dough is smooth, 8 to 10 minutes. Definitely keep track of that. I haven't set a timer because I can kind of, I've done it so many times now by feel that I kind of know what I'm looking for. You don't want to add a ton of flour in this. So, you know, I knead it until it starts to feel sticky again. And that's when I just try and dust it lightly with flour. There's a lot of different kneading techniques out there. This is the one I learned. This is the one I was taught. You just spin, fold, spin, fold. This is really a whole body workout. The bigger the dough, the more workout you get. This is a big clump of dough because I double the recipe every time. I get my whole weight into it. You can see, you know, I push from my shoulders all the way down into the dough. A little bit of flour, it's a little sticky. And this is the part where I kind of dust, or I try to dust. You know, not too much, just enough to take away the it sticking to your hands. You work it and work it. You just keep going. When I have a tendency, when I grab the dough, tips of my fingers hit the counter. So by the end of it, tips of my finger are pretty sore. All right, I got a little bread flour left, so I'm going to dust with that instead of the AP. That's a little more than dusting, but I don't need it. This, I think, is the most important step of the whole process, because this is really where you're building that nice gluten structure, where your dough really comes together. If you watch any of the, I always have to laugh at the Great British Baking Show when they make bread the way they knead their bread. And you know, Paul Hollywood. I always pay attention to what they're doing, but see if there's any new tricks of the trade out there. But I have found really that my way is what works best for me. If you find another way of doing it, that's great. Like a couple people I know, they just don't have the strength to do this kind of kneading anymore. So they'll use their forearms. They'll get in like this. Or, you know, they just won't make as much dough. You know, they'll make the regular size batch and not have to worry about dealing with this big lump of mess. Again, this is the part that's really all by feel. It's hard to really explain what I'm looking for. I would say the first time you do this, you know, make sure you set a timer when you start kneading and end kneading, and really, you know, try and stick to the recipe as much as you can. Just because, I mean, the recipe's been tried and tested so many times. The more you get into your bread making, the more times you do it, you'll really start learning what works, what doesn't work, what it's supposed to feel like, what it's not supposed to feel like, what it's supposed to look like. Whew. How's your day going? So what's happening is I'm getting little dough crumblies from dough that was stuck to the counter when I first started kneading it. That for a nice smooth dough, you want to try and avoid getting those in there. So you saw I just brushed them off a little bit. See how my hand sticks to that a little bit? I don't know if you can tell in the video, but when it gets that kind of sticky, that's when I like to dust it with flour. I'll flip it over now, do the same thing on the other side. kind of rub it in the top. I've probably said this to 100 different people. Eventually you'll find what works for you. I had a teacher in college who taught me in my drafting class. When I started it, I had zero experience on the program we were using. And she said, you know, Charlie, in this program there's 300 different ways to draw a straight line. You have to find what works for you and stick with that. So I actually apply that to a lot of my life. There's 300 different ways to do things. You have to find what works for you and stick with that. And really, that definitely applies to bread making and kneading. Is you got to find what works for you and stick with that. You know, how's that for a life lesson, right? Bread teaching you about life. Now this is a very sticky dough and I don't like it. I think I should have let that rise a little bit more. That's alright. That's what kneading is for. You know, it's that gentle touch that I've done this so many times that I can tell the dough is a little too sticky. That's why I'm probably kneading it a little bit longer than I want to, or I have in the past. Adding a little bit more flour this time. Until I'm out of breath. This is my workout for the day. I also suggest if you're wearing any jewelry to remove it at this point or before you start kneading it. I normally have a watch and other bracelets on. Just because you don't want to get dough all up in there. It's a pain in the butt to get it cleaned off. Yes, I do have this bracelet on. This is one I never take off. I'll deal with getting the dough out of it. Don't worry, I washed my hands before I started doing this. Alright, it seems to be coming along here. That's good. It's getting smoother. It's getting just about where I want it. That's great. Hear my hand hitting the counter? It's those tips. Ooh, they're gonna be sore. I think one more dusting and a little bit more kneading and I think we'll be there. Flip it, a little bit, rub it in. I got a timer up here telling me how long I've been kneading for. Alright. That should do it. I mean, it's still a little sticky, but it's nice and smooth, nice and round. I push and it kind of springs back. I'm happy with the way that dough is. So, I'm not going to show you this next part because it just involves washing my pan out. Make sure it's nice and clean. What I try and do is use warm water when I clean it out to get the bowl warm. I'll dry it really nicely and then you grease the inside of your bowl. I use Crisco. Crisco, all vegetable Crisco. Some people use olive oil, some people use vegetable oil, some people use Pam spray. I have found this Crisco is the best one, the best to use. Just a thin layer all the way around your bowl, because as it rises, the dough's going to stick to the side of it. So I'll line my bowl, I'll wash my bowl, make sure it's nice and warm, line it with the Crisco, put the dough in it, and I cover it with, this is just an all flour bag dishcloth. Nice cotton dishcloth. It's great. Throw it over there, pop it in your nice warm dry spot in the oven, and let it rise for the given amount of time. Mine will be 45 minutes. Look at your recipe, whatever it says for that recipe, follow that. All right, I'll join back with you. So I do want to add, there's 2 rises in this. You let it rise for 45 minutes, you punch it down in the bowl, and you actually physically push it down with your fists. Okay, and the book, I think the book actually says 35 to 40 times, and then put it back in your rising spot. Let it rise for another 45 minutes or whatever your recipe says. I'm not going to film that and show it to you because it's pretty easy. But then, so I'll pick it back up after my second rise from this stage, and when we form the loaves and put them in the pans. Thanks for watching.